Hello, greetings, everybody. My name is James. I'm from the internet. And today we are going to be talking about wages. Now, ever since the United States of America decided that the pandemic was mostly over and it was time for everybody to get back to work, there has been a raging debate between people who can afford goods and services who want everybody else to go back to work for as little as possible, and all of the other people who used to work the jobs that paid as little as possible, who want to get paid better wages before they come back to work. Apparently, this is a great source of conflict, lots of debate going back and forth. So while this debate has been going on, there's been the larger question of a living wage versus minimum wage versus a working wage. And while we have been discussing all of this, there is one other type of wage worker who has fallen through the cracks of this conversation, and that would be people who live on server wages. There's an entire restaurant industry out there that is built upon paying the overwhelming majority of its workforce $2.13 an hour for their labor, with the understanding that you, the customer, in addition to paying a lot of money for food and service, are also going to give even more cash out of your pocket to make up the difference between the $2.13 an hour that those people make and the current minimum wage. And so what I wanted to do today was I wanted to bring up an opinion piece that appeared in Philly Mag today. And I want to discuss the difference between a working wage, a living wage, and a server wage. More importantly, I want to discuss the privilege of owning a restaurant, the privilege of being able to go out and afford massively expensive dinners during the middle of an economic downturn, and demanding that people come back to work for as little as possible, as quickly as possible, because gosh darn it, you deserve a really nice sit-down dinner while other people serve you. Here we go. Why I don't have a problem with Steak 48's $100 minimum dining fee. The restaurant's $100 minimum policy has faced backlash, but those who aren't willing to pay for fine dining should reconsider their entitlement. Y'all, I want you to remember the use of the word entitlement here because it's going to come up a few more times today. One way to tell that restaurants are coming back. Restaurant drama is breaking out online. Take the debate raging in Philadelphia over the new policies at Steak 48. The upscale chain restaurant, located on Broad and Spruce Streets, is now requiring a $100 per person minimum in food and drink purchases. They also plan to enforce a strict dress code, one that bans sweatshirts or t-shirts with large images, and, quote, clothing emitting offensive odors such as perfume, cologne, tobacco, and marijuana odors. Although Steak 48 has locations in Houston, Charlotte, Chicago, and Philadelphia, the minimum is only being implemented in the Chicago and Philadelphia locations, while, of course, the new dress code is going into effect in all of the restaurants in their chain. But while dress codes have long been the source of controversy at local restaurants, it's the minimum that's got all of social media in an uproar. So apparently, they put a sign in their front window explaining all their new policies, and of course, social media just absolutely erupted with their opinions over why this is snobby, why this is elitist, why this is wrong. Now, at the end of the day, they're a business. It's their prerogative. They can put up a sign in their front window that says, we don't want people who have large baggy clothes with logos and smell like weed. We don't want people who can't afford to pay at least $100 a pop to come in here. In fact, it is not even worth our time to have you walk into this restaurant and sit down unless you can spend $100 a pop. You're just not worth it to us. And hey, again, that's fine. They want to draw a line in the sand and say we are an upscale, expensive restaurant. And thus, our clientele should only be people who can afford to act appropriately and spend at least $100 a pop. Now, the author, who is obviously an aficionado of restaurants in Philadelphia, where you can easily drop $100 a head, seems totally unconcerned with this as well. For starters, spending $100 at an upscale steakhouse isn't too hard to do. According to the Inquirer, the average per-person check at Steak 48 around the time of its September 2020 opening was $120 before tax and tip. Translation: if you go for a standard dining experience, one that includes an appetizer, entree, a side dish or two, and a cocktail, you'll easily reach this minimum. Anyone who's ever eaten at a fancy steakhouse in Center City shouldn't have a problem with this. So, if their average check was $120 a pop, then why would you need to institute a $100 minimum? Oh, that's right, because you're marketing it as upscale. That's the point here. They're trying to drive other people away. We only want the people who have a shit ton of money. And what I want to remind you about is that as this raging debate is occurring, people who make a shit ton more than $15 an hour desperately want to go back to eating at restaurants like this, with no mention or no concern of the fact that the people bringing them their food are literally getting paid $2 an hour. So surely, since this restaurant is selling a dining experience that's high class, surely they are going to pay more for labor so that they have top tier servers, the kind of people who would give the kind of service that would be worth $100 a pop, right? Surely this chain of eateries is going to pay their staff very well to make sure they get top quality service to go along with the top quality prices they're charging, right? Right? Let's not forget those who suffered the most in the past year were the essential workers, who still had to be hospitable regardless of the portion size being requested at those tables. Servers were already dealing with lower than usual tips during the pandemic. If the respectable tip rate is 20% at a restaurant, anything less than $100 per person is less than a $20 tip. This would make sense at dining spots that are serving fast casual because they have higher turnover on their smaller bills. But imagine working at a steakhouse where people are ordering and tipping like it's happy hour. Oh, those peasants. Now, what I want you to understand in this little paragraph here is this person as a restaurant reviewer, as a connoisseur of fine restaurants that serve $80 steaks. Well, this guy seems to be really hung up on the respectable tip rate. Not a mandatory tip rate, not a standard gratuity. No. He's solely basing his opinion on this being good for $2.13 an hour servers on the fact that, of course, wealthy people who can afford to pay $80 for a steak and $120 for a dinner, surely those people are going to tip well. Now, for all of you in the audience watching this right now, show of hands, how many of you have ever worked in the service industry? Cool. Next question. How many of you have ever served somebody who was obviously wealthy, threw around a ton of money, rang up a huge fucking tab, and then tipped you next to nothing? For the record, the rest of you watching this video, every single person who raised their hand the first time raised their hand the second time. You just can't see them. Thank you. I'll continue now. Steak 48's mandatory $100 minimum is a reasonable and equitable expectation for customers. Since the pandemic, other restaurants have found less controversial ways to ensure better pay for their servers, but not this restaurant. No. The author will tell you this is the same idea. No, this isn't the same idea. This restaurant is saying they only want people who can afford a $100 dinner and then just presume that they will tip $20 because that's considered the respectable rate. Now, of course, he makes reference to other restaurants in the locale who, since the pandemic, have switched to adding additional mandatory fees to the bills to counter for the fact that their former wait staff is now essentially doing carry-out service. It's just as much labor, but less opportunity to make tips. So they are adding mandatory fees. Why? Because their entire business plan is predicated upon paying people $2 an hour. So they were not going to make up the difference. No, they expect you, the customer, to make up the difference. Why? Because fuck you, that's why. To eat at a fine dining space like Steak 48 is a luxury, not a necessity. Like all things luxurious, it costs to be the boss. Those who aren't willing to dine maturely and tip appropriately should reconsider their entitlement and arguably their morals. Right, but no question of restaurateurs who want to pay people not only below a living wage, but below the minimum wage. Correct? Author from Philly Mag? No. The entire onus should be on the diner, not the restaurateur. No. You shouldn't pay your workers a living wage. You should just charge a shit ton for your steak and assume that the people who come in to eat the expensive steak will tip respectably, because you as an employer are doing the bare minimum, and the bare minimum is paying that staff $2.13 an hour and assuming that everybody else will pick up the slack. Why? Because this is what shitty capitalists do. They spend as little of their own money as possible and just assume that everybody else will pick up the slack. It's almost as if they feel they are entitled to spend other people's money, demand other people's money, but God forbid, they spend their own money. No, we can't have that happen, no. During a pandemic that's causing many restaurants to close their doors for good, leaving their workers in desperate circumstances, now is not the time to push back against a policy that is ensuring they make a decent living wage. Oh, living wage? They're getting $2.13 an hour. That's all they're getting. They're getting $2.13 an hour and the privilege of possibly getting more from a tip from a customer if they decide they want a tip, because the restaurant didn't add an automatic gratuity and the restaurant didn't pick up the slack. Instead, they're just assuming that raising prices and increasing their own revenue, that money will just somehow, I don't know, trickle down to the staff making $2.13 an hour. And now, before I go, I want to show you why this whole thing is even worse than you thought it was when I finished my last sentence. So I spent an hour or so going over some of the new labor requirements that came out, and it reminded me about a video I shot last December. And in that video, I let everybody know that Donald Trump, Steve Mnuchin, and members of the Restaurant Association all got together and they passed through a whole bunch of new labor regulations for restaurant workers. And snuck into the pile of them was this fun little ditty. Back in the day, when you paid somebody $2.13 an hour, only 10% of their total hours could be non-tipped labor, i.e., if you hired somebody to be a waiter or a waitress and you had them scheduled for 30 hours a week, well, then they could only spend 3 hours a week doing non-tipped labor, or else you would have to pay them the minimum wage. And that's side work, polishing silverware, marrying ketchup, etc., etc. This is standard fare for servers. However, the Trump administration on the way out changed a little part of that rule amongst some other rules they threw in. And essentially what they did was they got rid of the 10% minimum, meaning now any restaurateur in America can hire anybody at $2.13 an hour, saying that they're hiring them as a server, and then have them go wash dishes for 40 hours a week and only pay them $2.13 an hour. That was the whole plan. So Biden came in, put a freeze on some of it. They reviewed a whole bunch of the different pieces of this new labor law and then started pushing it back out. You know what they came up with? This is good stuff, people. Employers in restaurants can now mandate tip outs from all of the serving staff. And those tip outs, which is something that a lot of servers would normally do anyway amongst themselves, pooling tips and then giving a certain amount to barbacks, dishwashers, bus people, people who clear the tables, etc. No. So what they did was they created a new mechanism within the law that now allows these restaurateurs to create mandatory tip pools. All the servers have to put all of it in there, and then they dole it out. And part of that will go to the dishwashers. You know, the people they're paying $2.13 an hour to. Oh, well, they give them a portion of the server's tips, and then if at the end of the week they haven't hit their total minimum wage from washing dishes all week, including the $2.13 an hour and the portion of the server's tips, then and only then does the restaurant kick in the difference. In other words, they just phased out an entire minimum wage job, turned it into a $2.13 an hour job, and are now making all the servers make up the difference to all those dishwashers. This is how the restaurant industry continuously works with legislators to skim more money out of the pockets of the working class to keep revenues and profits for wealthy capitalists high. So what can you, as a fellow member of the working class and a fellow consumer, do to help people who are trapped in restaurant hell? Well, here's a few ideas I got. Number one, if you are the type of person who could actually afford to go out and spend $80 to $100 a head at a restaurant, maybe you go online, you find yourself like a private chef, which nowadays normally means somebody who was a cook at a restaurant that closed down recently, people who are also desperate for work. You can call those people up, give them a menu idea. They will shop for all the groceries, come to your house, cook you an amazing meal, clean, leave, you pay them, you give them a gratuity, and now none of that money is being skimmed by some shitty restaurateur who owns 6 bougie steakhouses located across the United States of America that are only paying their dishwashers $2.13 an hour and expecting all the servers to pick up the slack so that they could pay them less. Now, if you're like most of the rest of us and you can't afford to do that sort of thing, don't worry, there's still a lot you can do. Every single restaurant in every single town nowadays, they have a Facebook page. They have some social media presence, whether it's on delivery apps or on Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else. Go onto those social media pages and ask very loudly, do you pay all of your employees minimum wage? Do you pay your employees a living wage? Be loud. Ask repeatedly. Because what the showdown about minimum wage workers at McDonald's and other fast food places have shown us is that if you are loud enough and you shame these capitalists enough in front of their investors and in front of their customers, they will miraculously find the money to pay people a living wage because they've had the ability to do it all along. They've just chosen not to. You are the consumer. You get to make noise. You get to make businesses work to earn your business. So start asking questions loudly and then support the local businesses in your area who support your neighbors and other people who live in the area by paying them a living wage. Until next time, my name is James. I am from the internet and I am out. Peace.